Hey, this video is a continuation of the project that we started building where we're consuming the ProPublica API, the House Salad base app. This code is up on GitHub if you wanted to kind of start and take a look and work from the starting point that I'm at. One of the downsides to what we were doing in that particular application is the tests that we were writing were making real API calls out to ProPublica. As you can imagine, this is not great, right? So like every time we run our test suite, we're making multiple API calls, which there's a number of reasons why this isn't great, right? You could hit API rate limits faster, it slows the test suite down, and if anyone comes into the project and doesn't have an API key set up, we make it more difficult to start working within it. So what we're going to show here is how to start to set up an application that mocks out those API calls. The library we're going to use is a library called Webmock. We're going to actually show two different approaches. The first one is going to use Webmock, which you can see on GitHub, and we're going to set this up as a gem, and we're going to get that going, and then we're going to get into VCR as well. So to start off with, I want to jump into my feature test. And inside of this feature test, when we do this search right now, it actually has to go make a real API call to ProPublica, which happens here in this ProPublica service class. It makes this Faraday call here, gets set up, and then we call getJSON, which makes a GET request to a URL. Go ahead and close that out. We want to make sure that that is not happening for real. The way Webmock works is we can give it, at its simplest form, is we can give it specific HTTP verbs to look out for. So in this case, the simplest example says any. So any HTTP request, any verb that gets made to example www.example.com. We can get more specific with this. We can specify specific HTTP verbs that we're looking for. And we can also start to get into stubbing with a custom response, which there is a section on the page here. Let me just do a quick page search. Stubbing with custom response. Cool. So what this is doing is basically it's saying, when we send a GET request to www.example.com, that it's going to return a value of ABC. The reason is that when we stub the request, we stub any HTTP verb, including GET, obviously, and then when we make that call, it's going to return a body of a string of ABC. What we're going to do in our scenario is we're going to stub this request, but instead of returning a string like this, what I want to do is paste in a real JSON response and save it as in like a fixtures directory or something like that. That way we can test against the real structured data that we might get back from the API. So the first thing I'm going to have to do here is I'm going to have to install Webmock. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my gem file. One thing to note about Webmock is that this is going to prevent external HTTP requests from being made by default if you install it, which we might not want to do, probably don't want to do in development or production, but if we are in our test environment, that seems like a good use case for it. So I'm going to go ahead and install Webmock in the test group, and I'm going to bundle. And if we look at the documentation, we can see that there's this section on stubbing with a custom response inside of the docs. And you'll see what you end up doing is you pass, there's a stub request method, and we can pass it the HTTP verb that we want to send in, the URL, and we can tell it to return something. We do this by passing it the body key, and then whatever we want to pass it. So in our case, we've created a fixture with the real JSON response here from the API. That lives inside of fixtures. I'll just kind of show that really fast. I can open up fixtures, and there we go. and this has all of our fake, or it's actually a real API data. Next, I want to actually start to use this, and I'm going to follow this like stub request approach here. So I'll go ahead and write out stub request. We need to send in the HTTP verb that we want to allow through. This is going to be a GET request in this scenario. And then the next thing is the actual URL that we want to hit. I'm just going to grab it from here. One gotcha. I'm realizing that I think our form is submitting the value CO in caps, and this is lowercase. That could be a problem, so I'm just going to change this to capital CO, just to make sure that doesn't trip us up later. Because Webmock is going to look for an exact match. If it sees caps and in the request that gets made, but we're stubbing out the lowercase version of this, it's not actually going to catch it. So just a heads up there. So stub request, and then the next thing is we need to tell it what to return. Oops, this is the one we're looking at. To return. And we can send back a status. I'll just send back 200. And then we can send back a body. And in this case, I'm going to go create a variable called JSON response. I don't want to make this line too long. And then up here, I'll just go define what that is. So JSON response. And I'll just open the fixture that we created earlier. So do file.open. And that lives inside of the root directory of the project, inside of fixtures. Oops. And I forget what we named it. Let me go open that up. Members of the house JSON. All right. Let's give it a quick run and see how we did. Awesome. So now we're passing. The big test here will be like if I turn off my Wi-Fi and run this same test, see if in fact we can still get this test to pass. And we're good. Cool. Turn that back on because I think we might need it later. All right, so that's basically how to use Webmock. There's probably a few other places in this app that we could do this same sort of thing. Let's go and run our test suite as a whole. So keep that open. We see a bunch of warnings. Interesting. I should go look for that, see exactly why that's happening. Oh, right. So now you'll see the two failures that we have are at the model layer and the services layer. We must be making API calls somewhere in there in one of these tests, probably this one here. And one of the things that Webmock is going to do is prevent us from making real HTTP requests outside of our application. So we'll have to go update the service as well. But it does look like our feature test is passing. So we're good there. I think I want to get rid of those warnings. I'm going to look into that once we get to a green state. But let me go ahead and continue working on this. So let's open up that service, the service spec for ProPublica service spec. So this is making a real API call as well. I want to show a different technique for how to do this one. There's another library out there called VCR, which is similar purpose, but the difference is that VCR will go make a real API call or HTTP request. It'll make a real HTTP request the first time if it doesn't have what it refers to as a cassette. The cassettes get recorded for us automatically. So basically what will happen is VCR, you'll run your test suite. VCR will, if there's an HTTP call request made, VCR will record into a YAML file the contents of that response, and it'll save it as what it refers to as a cassette. The next time we go and we run our test suite, it'll basically play that cassette so that it doesn't go and make the real request. It'll just play whatever we have recorded. The downside to using something like VCR is that at some point we need to make a real request. The advantage to using something like Webmock is we never have to make the real call. The downside to something like Webmock is that we never make the real call. So like the API could change or something like that, and we'd have to have something in place to catch like API changes. Whereas with VCR, if we delete the cassettes periodically, maybe on a nightly basis, weekly basis, whatever, we could catch changes that happen to our API. So I'm gonna show how to kind of set that up here for this ProPublica service test. I kind of like using something like VCR at this layer because this is like the source of making those API calls, and then maybe everywhere else I kind of like using Webmock. That way we're not super dependent on using like making real API calls, and most of our code could be stubbed out with just like fixture data or whatever. So let's go ahead and start to set that up. I'll go open up a tab here. I'll just look for VCR on GitHub. The docs here show how to set it up using test unit, but I'll show you. It's pretty much the same setup for using RSpec for the most part. So we'll have to go add a gem to our gem file, of course. So we'll go ahead and open that up. I'll just close this out so it's not distracting. I'll add it down into the same test block here, right above Webmock. And I'll go ahead and install that. The next thing I want to do is start to set up things inside of our application. Oops, wrong file. Open up the Rails helper. If we put it inside of this Rails helper, the gem file is going to get loaded when we load the Rails environment and all of that. So we shouldn't need to require VCR explicitly. We could just load it in here. So we could just do this config block right there. This tells us where we want to store the recorded HTTP responses. And so in this scenario, we're going to store it in that fixtures directory as well, but we're going to put them inside of a subdirectory in there called VCR cassettes. This is also going to be using Webmock, so you kind of need it for this particular setup. It needs to hook into something. There are other libraries that you can use, but I'll just show how to use Webmock since we've already got it installed. And then basically you wrap the contents of whatever's going to be making the call and the expectations or assertions or whatever, you can put them inside of a use cassette block. So we'll have to go find a test that uses this, and in our case we're going to do this inside of the ProPublica service spec. This test up here doesn't make a real on line 4. This doesn't make it a request. It's this one a little bit later that does. So I'm going to go ahead and do VCR.useCassette. And I'm actually remembering that there's another way to configure this with RSpec to basically use the metadata or like the names of our tests to like name the cassettes. I'll set that up in just a little bit here, but I'm going to start with this more verbose approach. So we'll give this cassette a name. So I'll just call it like ProPublica service members by state. And close that block out. Just fix the indentation. And I think that might be it. So the first time we run this, it should make the real API call. And then the second time we run it, it should use the recorded result. All right, so that passed. Let me just run it one more time for good measure, make sure that we pass the second time. And then I'll turn my Wi-Fi off and make sure we pass again. Cool, so we're good there. The next thing that isn't great about using these cassettes, that if you're not aware could cause a problem, is that when we make these HTTP requests, we're making them with our real API key, and it's not great. It's actually pretty bad if we were to check these cassettes in, and we would have like real API keys stored without them or throughout them. And so VCR provides this like filter sensitive data like option that we can use, and we would do this. So here's an example of how to use it. Basically, it's going to look for whatever's inside of this block and replace it with whatever is this this parameter that gets passed here. So I'll show you what that would look like. So I'll go open up my Rails helper, come inside of here, and now I need to do config dot filter sensitive data. And I'll pass it whatever I want to replace with. So in this case, I'll just put in a generic, like, I guess this is like our ProPublica. Oops. API key. And then we pass it a block, and we have to tell it what to replace. So it'll like do a search for the string and then replace it with ProPublica API key. In our case, the real key, I could hard code it here, but it's probably more flexible and better to put in the environment variable, because this file would also get checked in probably. So we called that ProPublica key. All right. The next thing I'm going to do is delete my cassettes. So I'm just going to remove the cassettes directory from fixtures, and it's in fixtures and then VCR cassettes. I'm just going to delete the whole directory since we only have one cassette in there. And I'm going to run my test suite and see how that goes. I'll come back and look at these warnings in just a minute. All right, so we still have one file or one test that's failing, but we did just get our service test to pass, and hopefully we've filtered out our real API key from showing up in our cassettes. Let's go take a look. So that's going to live inside of fixtures, VCR cassettes, and here we go. So here's our URL, like the path that we're making the call to. Here's the method, and then check it out. Our X API key has been replaced with this placeholder for now. So that looks like it worked. We are filtering out the sensitive data. The next thing is with RSpec, we have this ability to, that was in our service spec. We can automatically name our cassettes using the metadata in here, and I'm just going to go do a quick Google search for that as well, because I forget exactly how to do it. Cool, so we can pass this configure RSpec metadata method. So that'll open up in our Rails helper. And what this should allow now is, instead of doing this block thing here where we do vcr.useCassette, we should be able to delete the do in the end, and then I think we can just pass a symbol VCR like that. I'm going to delete the cassette that currently exists just to make sure that we're okay and that it's really working. Let's try this again. Cool. So that passes. It's a little bit cleaner, right? Because now anytime we wanted to use VCR, we just do symbol VCR inside of the name of our test. And let's just double check that we're still filtering out the sensitive data, just make sure everything is going all right. So this is going to be inside of fixtures, VCR cassettes. Yeah, and you'll notice that the name is different now. That it's called ProPublica Service, all caps, which is the name of the test that we have here in the describe block, and then this is the name of the it block that the test is actually written inside of. And we still have our data filtered out. So this looks good. All right, so that means then we have one last test here to try to figure out why it's failing. And it says that there's an unhandled HTTP request. So let's take a look. This is in member search results spec. So models, member search results spec. Right, so this is kind of doing the same thing, something similar to our feature test. And I think I'm just going to jump back to Webmock for this. I think seeing both of them is good, but I usually reach for Webmock whenever I can. I think it's just like a little bit easier to control, and it's easier for other developers to jump in and use it. So I'm just going to grab these two lines, because these three lines here, because I think it should be the same. And let me run this test. Let's see if we're any better. Cool, so now that passes. Let me jump back here and then run my test suite. All right, awesome. So now we're back to green. Everything's green. Everything's been mocked and stubbed out. All right, so now I want to try to figure out exactly why we have all these warnings showing up. And what I'm seeing here is that it says that it's already initialized JSON version. What that tells me is that there's probably something that's being loaded from the gem file and then something being loaded again. And my hunch, if I remember correctly, I think we threw something inside of the spec helper. Specifically, I think it was Webmock. Yeah. If you look at the top of this, we put Webmock at the top of the spec helper here. Let me see first of all if it gets rid of the error if we move it into the Rails helper. And I'll explain why that might have made a difference. All right, let's go run RSpec again. Cool, and that got rid of it. So the reason I think that this was happening is automatically when the Rails environment gets loaded, it requires anything that's in our gem file unless we tell it not to. So typically, if you wanted to throw something inside of the spec helper here, the spec helper doesn't load the Rails environment. However, the Rails helper will. And so if we put it inside of the spec helper, it'll require it explicitly. And then when it loads the Rails environment, it ends up loading anything in the gem file again as well. So it was getting loaded 2 times. A possible workaround for that would be that we could go into the gem file and just tell it not to automatically load. But for the sake of this video, I think it's fine to just add the Webmock to the Rails helper. I think it's a little bit easier. So next up, I want to kind of remove the duplicate code that we have in both our feature test and this is for the stubbing, and then inside of our search spec. So you'll see we have this like exact same lines of code for the JSON response and then the stub request. This seems like a thing that we'll probably end up doing multiple times. So I'm going to go ahead and just extract this out into a helper really quickly. You might want to load it into like a separate file as a helper, but I'm just going to do the simplest thing and place it inside of my Rails helper. So here, I'm going to go ahead and just define a method, and I'll call it stub get JSON. And we'll take in a couple different parameters. The first parameter that we'll do is we'll take in a URL, and we'll do a file name. And what I'm imagining is that we'll store all of our fixtures in the same directory. So if we just get the file name, like the name of the file, then we should be good to locate it. And then we'll just decide on the URL. And because this is going to be a GET request every time, and because the thing that we're going to parse is going to be JSON, I think that we should be able to get by with just those couple of pieces. Next up then, I'm going to start off with, I'll go ahead and start in the search results spec first. So up top I have my new helper method that I'm building, and then down here I have my member search results spec. So I'm going to go ahead and call the method that I want to do, this new helper that I'm going to use. I'm going to call stub get JSON, and I'm going to pass it a URL and then a file name. The file name, I think, is just going to be this portion, the members of the house .json piece. And I guess we could even just go members of the house since it's going to be JSON every time. So I'll do file name. And you know, I'll tack on JSON just so it's clear that it's like what's kind of being expected here. This line here, I'm going to move up into this file, into the helper, and I'm going to replace the segment here with the variable or the parameter that's being passed in for file name. And then the next thing I need to do is figure out which URL, which should be this one right here. So grab this. Oops. And we can call this URL. So that should be enough to hopefully maybe get these couple pieces wired together. And then I just got to move the rest of this code over. So we've got the file.open stuff pasted up above. I'll grab these couple of lines here. And now I just need to replace this with the URL that's being passed in. And then maybe that will work. Let's give this a shot. I'm going to comment out those lines of code that we were used to be using. Replace it with this new stub here, the stub get JSON, and we'll run the file. Cool, that passed. So the next thing I'm going to do is do the same thing. I can go ahead and delete these lines of code. I can open up the feature spec that we had and replace those lines of code up above with the ones down below. And this should hopefully pass as well. There we go. And now I'm going to go run the whole test suite just to confirm that everything is wired together correctly and that we didn't accidentally break something else. And great, we're passing. So this makes it a little bit more reusable in the future. I extracted this out into multiple lines, but obviously you don't have to. I think it just makes it a little bit easier to read. So yeah, this showed multiple different ways to stub and mock things out so that we don't have to make real API calls. My general approach is I tend to prefer using Webmock whenever possible, but VCR is really useful. And if there are scenarios where you want to mock it out or stub the response most of the time, but then occasionally make the real call, I think something like VCR is great to do exactly that. And so I figured it would be useful to kind of see both. Go ahead and play around with each and then see which you have a preference for. Thanks so much. Hope this is useful.